Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin,
And I'm Justin Clark.
and today we are talking about the future of health and mortality. For this topic, we thought it'd be a good idea to include a medical expert in this discussion. So I'd like to introduce the first ever guest on Hence the Future podcast, Martin Mullen. Dr. Martin Mullen is a physician and eye surgeon. He is currently doing his residency in ophthalmology at the University of Texas. He's also a very good friend and cousin of mine. We have traveled to many parts of the world together, most recently in Fiji. And he's my go-to person whenever I have a question on medicine or health or anything related to those topics. And because he has just recently graduated medical school and become a doctor, he has the additional advantage of being taught the most recent up-to-date medical knowledge. Martin, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
Sweet. So before we get into future scenarios and all the cool stuff about us becoming immortal, potentially becoming gods, and all those questions about who we are and some more philosophical finer points, I think it'd be good to get a current lay of the land for where we are right now. So we hear a lot about futurist medical technologies like robotic surgeries, AI doctors diagnosing patients like with Watson, personalized cancer treatments based on someone's DNA, and any other sort of bleeding edge medical technologies. So I want to ask you, in your current work, how real are these futuristic technologies? Are they being used every day? Is it still pretty new? Give us your insights.
I mean, for the ones that you just mentioned there, they're still pretty new. They're just sort of coming to market now. They've been around maybe for the last 5 to 10 years. Specifically, if you think about like robotic surgery, there's a machine called the Da Vinci that's out there right now. And it's mostly used for surgeries like in the abdomen, abdominal surgeries. I know urology uses it very commonly. And basically, it's like, there are several like arms of this robot that are going in and operating through really small incisions so that they can do it through a video screen. And the surgeon is actually like in a corner of the room, not next to the patient, operating almost like a video game. A lot of these things are kind of like a video game. So, the advantage, as people say, is that, your smaller incisions, quicker healing time, things like that, less sort of collateral damage when you go in for surgery.
And how come it's specifically for the abdominal versus like ophthalmology or some other procedure?
Yeah, I mean, they are sort of starting to introduce this more into other fields as well, but this is kind of the first one. I think mostly because it's kind of a bigger area to operate in, So some of like the finer skills in some of like microsurgery fields, like ophthalmology, where we operate on the eye, is really a microsurgery field. And I don't think there are any robots out there yet that can really match the dexterity of the human hand, that can really like make very subtle differences with your fingers, things like that. But in ophthalmology now, there is a machine called the LensX for cataract surgery, where part of the surgery is done through, I guess you could call it a robot, but it's really like an automated laser. So if you think about cataract surgery, what it is, there's a lens in the eye, kind of like there's a lens in a camera. And when we're born, it's crystal clear. And as we age, it starts to become cloudy. And so that's what a cataract is. It's a cloudy lens. So the surgery removes the lens and puts in an artificial lens, an implant in there. So part of it is the surgery is you have to like peel a little circle in the top part of the lens, the anterior capsule. And right now we do this just by hand by making a little nick in it. And it's really it's like peeling if you think about it almost as like a chocolate covered or a peanut M&M, and really the shell is
delicious.
It's really about that thick. Yeah, exactly. And so you're just like sort of peeling this hole in the front part of it. Now a laser can just go, you can just line it up properly and the laser just boom, creates the hole right there for you. And then breaks up like the center part as well. And so, there are some people who are still like most people are trained the other way and get used to it and then never really like develop the skills because it is a learning curve on the other machine as well. So, but I do think that'll probably end up being the way of the future for a lot of things is that, most of it will be done by a robot up until it can really match like the decision making of a human, of an experienced surgeon, and like the dexterity of a human hand, which I think is really far off in the future.
Do these these automated surgeon tools, do they speed up the procedure at all Because I
Like,
know some surgeries last an extremely long time.
yeah, like right now they actually
This
like
one's-
that's one of the arguments against it is that it like slows things down a little bit because it takes time. You have to bring them to
okay.
one room for one machine first, and they do like the laser portion in there, and then you bring them into the other OR where they have the other set of equipment. So for somebody who's like really used to the old way where it's just they can get in and like do it really quickly, it's not that much more efficient. But I think as people start to
Okay.
become like more trained in it, it will become more efficient or more efficient than at least what it is right now.
Yeah, I was watching this Netflix documentary the other day called Bleeding Edge, which is about, it's kind of the scary side of medical advances, and it basically talks about all of these stories of cutting edge technologies that ended up having really bad unintended effects, precisely because new equals untested. And there were some people that had the Da Vinci system for some sort of abdominal something, and they ended up having all of these complications. And the basic conclusion was that it's not that the Da Vinci system was fundamentally flawed. It's more that a lot of the doctors didn't have enough training to where it was more effective than if they were just going in by hand.
Right. And then that's the thing, you always have to be skeptical about a lot of these new technologies come out, especially if, you're a physician. Is this something that like the industry is just trying to push, to kind of make money, or is this something that's actually going to like help patients, make things better, make surgeries more accurate, make outcomes better? And then also like you have to consider, like obviously, like you're saying, there's going to be, anytime there's a new technology coming out, there's going to be a learning curve for that. And there might be a period of time where it's not better until the surgeon has more experience with it. So that's also something to consider.
And you said that you don't foresee autonomous surgery being something that's going to be widely adopted anytime soon. But what do you mean by soon? Do you think, let's say in the next 50 years, do you think the majority of surgeries will be done by robots versus by hand?
Well, I was about to say in our lifetime, but then that brings up a whole nother point about how long we think our lifetime. We'll touch on that in a little bit.
Yeah, we should talk about that next.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to predict something like that. I mean, the way I do see things going in medicine is that things will probably become much more automated with AI, at least from the diagnostic side of things, because a lot of times, like as doctors, we're just interpreting a lot of different, lab values, some facts like EKG findings, imaging, like things like that. And we take this collection of data and, kind of make a diagnosis. And eventually, as we have like better AI to do that, I know they're definitely working on that, but it's not quite like prime time yet. So I see probably in the next 20 years, like most of the diagnosis part of taking care of patients will probably be done, if not totally by AI and by computers, then at least with that help of having them available to you, and sort of with human oversight. As far as surgeries go, it's just harder to say. It really matters. Like if you look at how prosthetics have come, like, artificial limbs and stuff. I mean, an artificial leg is like right now really, really good. I mean, they've come a long way. But still, like a hand or an artificial arm is really not as good as a human arm or anywhere even close. And that's really what you'd have to think about creating, is you'd have to be able to create a robotic arm or some kind of thing that can manipulate a really small instrument just as good as a human hand. And I think we're pretty far from being able to do something like that.
It seems like a machine learning problem, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think most of these diagnostic sort of, challenges that we face are really something that could be solved with machine learning. Because I think the first thing to change probably in the healthcare field is that, a lot of times we rely very heavily on imaging, CT scans, MRIs, things like that. And those are interpreted by humans, by radiologists. And they've been working for years, I mean, honestly, since the 80s on creating a computer-aided diagnostic system that can diagnose what the radiologist can read. And still, it's not nearly as good as like a seasoned radiologist right now. But you just got to think it's getting there, if we just give it more time. Because a lot of these things are pattern recognition, and if it's really something that, a human is interpreting based on their own experience and is able to, sort of program that into a computer, then the computer will arguably do a better job. But I think the problem is being able to articulate in code, like what it is you're looking for, But with machine learning, potentially you could upload like thousands, millions of images with each one with a diagnosis. And it's the computer itself that might be able to pick up on the patterns rather than you telling it what you should be looking for.
Yeah.
So
And
that's the
cool
way I
thing.
see it going, kind of.
I wonder
Go ahead.
if there's enough sharing of information among medical establishments, because it
Yeah.
seems like it's pretty, they're all sort of operating in their own area and they might not be sharing enough information. Whereas it seems like for machine learning to be really effective, we should probably be aggregating all of the CAT scans, all of the MRIs, all of the different
Right.
diagnostic information.
Well,
The
I think the other
problem with
issue is that, a lot of these, for as much high tech or as crazy as some of this robotic technology is that we have right now, and some of the really cool, interesting devices that we have in medicine. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're very behind the times in terms of tech too. I mean, there's like, if you think about the electronic medical record, I mean, we took a long time to make it mandatory that people had to have an electronic medical record, which you think is like crazy. Like, people were still using paper charts as of like 5 to 10 years ago.
Right. But there
The
are
one,
some apps now that you can, I mean, I think my sister, who's, she's always worried she might have some illness, but but she, I think, has started using this app where basically it has all of her medical information right there. You can
right.
chat with a doctor live. You can schedule an appointment very quickly, and they'll tell you if it's worth getting an appointment based on your symptoms and based on your diagnostics. So I
Right.
wonder if,
That's kind of like telemedicine
yeah, I wonder if
what
it's
it's
going
going
to end up
towards.
being some big medical tech company that's going to finally like aggregate the data, put in the machine learning,
Yeah.
and
I mean, I wish like Google or Apple or one of these companies would just take the challenge on themselves, but I think they don't want to deal with like all the bureaucracy, the government, the regulations, so
well,
they kind of
Amazon
steer
is
clear
starting
of
a
that realm.
healthcare. Amazon is starting their own
they
healthcare.
partnered with a couple of big insurance companies.
Right. So it seems like they are kind of making that move.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's it's a real challenge and it's something that's like really important for our society, but it might take one of these big companies with, the best coders and stuff to be working on this problem in order for get this thing moving. Because otherwise, you have these like smaller electronic medical record companies who are just like basically creating some software for us to, document, like chart what we've seen in the patient. Like, I don't think they have the vision of like creating something like more AI friendly or autonomous like in the future.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And is there current a diagnostic system that you use where you can input all of the measurements and symptoms and whatever else, and it'll give you some lay of the land, like sort of like an insider's WebMD, or is it pretty much all just you looking at a chart and deciding based on the knowledge that you've gathered throughout medical school and your training and your experience? It's more the latter.
Well, even now, I guess I can only think of a few instances where you have a lot of, sort of AI inputs. Like with the EKG is read by a computer right now when it prints off, but
Hmm.
it's not nearly as good. I mean, it's pretty good. It's surprisingly like not that bad, but it's not nearly as good as a trained physician.
Yeah.
And otherwise, I mean, when you look at maybe a lab value that would be abnormal that it comes up on a patient, it's going to like flag it red. Or if you prescribe a medication that might have like an interaction with another medication, it might flag it for you.
Hmm.
Be like, are you sure you want to prescribe that? So all those things I think are good, but it's nowhere close to having a system that is actually like offering a diagnosis based on a set of like all these different variables, facts, and, sort of
Right.
the whole picture of the patient.
Yeah, and I mean there are some really interesting future scenarios of what that could be. Like Michio Kaku, he's not my favorite futurist because sometimes he goes a little. He doesn't have like a single underlying philosophy that joins everything together. Like for instance, Yuval Noah Harari does. But he has some interesting future scenarios where it's like you wake up in the morning, as you're brushing your teeth, you get a full body scan that basically scans for any sort of irregularities. Maybe it's also in your toilet, so it sees like, what levels of nitrogen and whatever else you have in there, and basically it'll flag, oh, you need to see a doctor or you need to get this test, and that would just sort of happen automatically day to day. And that's obviously, it seems like that's a little far out, especially with the current scanning technology where, there's lots of radiation and other issues, but could you see something like that happening in the future?
Yeah. I mean, what I kind of see happening is like as we learn more about what genes might predispose you to different diseases, you'll probably everybody will get their like some kind of genetic test, maybe even at the time they're born, and it'll say like, oh, you have, X, 60% chance based on like this genetic makeup that you have of developing heart disease. So it should just be something that you like pay more attention to, and kind of all these risk factors based on your genes, that will be, I think, really the next thing as we start to learn more and more about, what genes do what.
Yeah. I could see that becoming a little bit scary also, because right now it's voluntary if you want to give over your DNA to 23andMe. And with that information, they can pretty much do whatever they want. They can sell it. The police can get a warrant in order to search that. That's how they caught the Golden State Killer finally. Was because, and it wasn't even he who had done 23andMe. It was, I think it was like his uncle or some distant relative, or a relative who was close enough that they could make a match. They could narrow it down to like 4 people. But if they did that for every person while they're born, you could potentially see some scary scenarios where, some virus breaks out and they're like, well, we're going to have to quarantine everyone with this genetic makeup.
Right.
Wow.
Or like, these people are at risk for rebellion. We must keep a close eye on them.
Right.
But
or like
anyways,
you have genes that like predispose you to, being a murderer or something like that. Or being a
like
very
Minority
aggressive type
Report.
person, and we're just going to like keep a very close eye on you from like the government or something.
Yeah. But anyways, before we get too ahead of ourselves, I want to talk about what I think the most interesting question for this whole topic, which is the issue of mortality and death and what causes death. How can we prevent what causes death, but also what causes aging? How can you slow down, stop, or even reverse aging potentially? And then there's many other questions like, how long would you even want to live? Like, let's assume the medical technology is there and you can basically replace every organ whenever you need to. You can even replace cells, fix neurons, whatever you need to do. So I guess maybe that's the first question we should ask, just so we get like sort of our own, what we would like to happen ideally in our own personal lives. So how many years? That's another interesting question. How many
different lives
would
would
you
you
want?
want?
For me, I think it would be 300. How many years would you ideally want to live? Option A, the same amount you naturally would if we have today's technology. Option B, let's say 2x that. So if you typically would live to 100, you live to 200. Option C, let's say anywhere from 200 to 1,000. And then D would be more than 1,000 years. So what would you guys, how long would you ideally like to live, assuming you would have your same physical fitness that you have right now?
Oh, interesting. So I was going to say it depends. I mean, I don't want to be 200 years old and decrepit and can't do anything and I'm cold all the time,
Right. No, let's assume that you can replace any neurons that go wonky. You can, you basically can like prevent aging altogether from this point forward.
I mean, then I would want to live 1,000 years probably, If you could say that I'm going to have the same quality of life that I'm having now,
Well,
exactly
physical
as Justin
quality
said.
of life. You might, with all those memories 1,000 years from now, you might be like a crazy person.
True. Yeah. But it would definitely be more than whatever. Like, I don't think the time that we have here on Earth is very long at all. I mean, we've even doubled like the life expectancy, over the last 200 years or so with, advances in medical care. And I still think like the average age of 78 or, close approaching 80 in the U.S. is still not that old, especially when you consider like most people's quality of life once they're in their 70s or 80s is not that great, So it's really only that you you can't guarantee anything, but that
Really, like
most people really have
65 years of really good living.
good quality of life. Yeah, if you take care of yourself and everything.
Yeah,
But if you
that's
can tell me that I'll be at the same health that I'll be when I'm like 30 or so, then yeah, I would definitely want to live to like 200, 300, maybe 1,000.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
But realistically, I mean, people talk about expanding your lifespan, but what about your health span? That's kind of what a lot of researchers are focusing on right now, is how to increase your health span rather than lifespan.
Right.
Right.
But I would definitely take 1,000 if I could, keep this.
Yeah, I
this
think I would
physical
come
health.
in somewhere around there. I think I'd probably come in more around like 750 years. Just because I don't know.
That last 250.
Yeah, well, just because I'm not that confident in
Living that long?
humans' ability to not nuke each other or cause some terrible thing to occur.
Right.
Or maybe once we reach artificial superintelligence, then the other superintelligent aliens start to take notice of us, and it's just hard to know what's going to happen when you look at timescales that are that long. But certainly more than 200 years, and certainly less than 1,000 years for me.
You got to think that people, if they could live to 1,000, they would have a much longer term view.
Yeah, especially if you
even
had
be
a
better
brain-machine
for
interface
society.
where you can augment your memory and processing system. Like, oh, did you hear about the new upgrade? I just got extra RAM. Like, I'm processing. You know how much work I can do in an hour? You wouldn't believe it. Like,
I mean, do you want to remember everything though? There are those people out there who like never forget anything,
Yeah.
and their like relationships with other people are just like really messed up because they can't let go of, they hold so many grudges. They can't forget like little things that somebody said.
Right.
It's like once you accumulate enough memories, like so many, is that, like you were saying, like, is that even a good quality of life?
Well, I would probably want it to be more similar to the Black Mirror episode, where it's not like you instantly remember everything all at once, but if you need to reference something that happened like 20 years ago, you can just
rewind it,
and then you just see it, and you're like basically living it through in first person, like a movie. And
right.
if you had to, or if you wanted to, you could delete those memories just like you can delete files in your computer, which has some other implications, especially with the law, and it's fascinating.
But to kind of get back to your point, or like initially what we were talking about, like what is aging though? I mean, it's really just it's accumulation of damage really to our cells, like just with normal metabolism, living normal life, like over time, over a certain number of years, you just accumulate damage to your DNA, and that just makes cells like not as viable as they once were. And then eventually that results in some kind of disease process. So, I mean, there's one interesting YouTube video, I think it's a TEDx talk by this guy, Aubrey de Grey, who's like a Cambridge researcher who's really into like anti-aging research. And he kind of makes the analogy of like always, as we develop technology that can really like harness the power of like reversing damage. So it's almost like having a lot of like maintenance checkups for your car or something. You go in, you see what genes might have been mutated, what might have been damaged just through normal aging process, or through you living in a city and breathing smog and being exposed to UV light and all that kind of stuff. And if we have a way to sort of reverse those genes or do gene therapy that can come somehow like slow down or reverse that aging process, then you can prevent like whatever pathology might end up developing as a result of that. And that potentially could prolong definitely like prolong your life.
Aubrey de Grey is a really interesting person because he works for the SENS Research Foundation. They're trying to end aging. He also has a book called Ending Aging. But yeah, like you said, it all amounts to, well, most of it amounts to cellular damage. But what do you think about the stem cell loss as we age too? That's one of his 7 causes of aging.
Yeah. I mean, they've been researching so much with stem cells, and like my gut feeling is that there's a lot of potential there. I mean, that's the problem a lot of times is you have cells that die or cells that age, and you want to replace them with new cells. Exactly. And you have these stem cells that have potential to grow into like brand new cells based on, your own DNA. And I think that is going to be a huge thing for the future. I don't think there's anything there that's quite viable yet. But, it's kind of like you got to think about the other challenges. Like you could regrow tissue like in a petri dish in a lab, oh, this is like muscle or this is heart tissue or whatever. But how do you actually like introduce that back into the human and get it into the spot that you need it to be and have it make all the connections that you need it to make with the rest of the body? Like that's, I think, probably where the biggest challenge lies.
Yeah.
So like if you have like some nanotechnology, some nanobots.
Yeah.
That's why you have those people that are injecting young blood into themselves too, based on that
blood boys.
Study. Yeah,
there's like that episode of Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Wait, is there anything to that though? I've always wondered.
Yeah, there's a mouse study where basically it's called Parabiosis, where they have two mice and they basically stitch them together. The blood from the young mouse is being fed into the old mouse. Yikes. And vice versa. So it extends the older mouse's life, and it also made the younger mouse age faster because it was getting old blood. Yeah. And there was I was looking at that study just to see exactly what the takeaways were, and the conclusion was kind of about stem cells, because the young blood has a lot more stem cells.
Well, it makes
probably
sense.
Like a bunch of different like growth factors or like nutrients that are in younger blood or something. Like, I think probably a lot of that is kind of BS, they're doing it right now. But I think, they got to find out sort of like, well, what component of the blood is it that is actually helping somebody live longer? Maybe it's like antioxidants. Maybe it's, maybe it's just that they are getting more oxygen or something. It's like you have to look at exactly what is it that's prolonging the life. And it's probably not just going to be a fix like you're just stealing other people's blood or manufacturing synthetic blood. It'll be more complicated than that.
It does make sense, though, that you would need to combat entropy by taking something away from energy away from one source and diverting that energy to another source. Yeah. Because it's like humans were only meant to live for 1.5 billion heartbeats. Like I was reading this study where they say every mammal pretty much lives for 1.5 billion heartbeats. So a whale and a mouse, they both have 1.5 billion heartbeats. It's just that mice are all strung out all the time, like freaking out, bugging out. And because of all that anxiety and their heart always beating.
They're just smaller too, their heart.
And that's the other thing is there's these scaling laws where as you get bigger, you tend to live longer because there's an energy saving, a 25% energy saving. So if you double the size of a mammal, you'll only have to expend 75% extra energy for that animal. So it's sort of like economies of scale, like, with like big businesses where you can get like, it's almost the way I think of it is more like almost like a neural net, where it's like as there's more neurons and there's more complexity to the system, where there's more like adjacent neurons and interactions that can happen. It's for whatever reason, there seems to be some energy savings. But I don't know what the necessary conclusion would be as far as how we can extend our life from that principle. Like, do we just make giant people whose hearts beat really slowly? And But, a tree, for instance, you could think of the trunk of the tree as the main artery of that tree. And a tree lives on a time scale that is so much slower than the time scale of us, and like way slower than something like a mouse. And for all we know, some trees may not have a natural point at which they die. They might, some trees have been around for thousands of years, and we don't know, when they're gonna naturally come to the end of their existence, if there is some point like that for them.
Yeah. The only studies that I'm aware of that have shown like the ability to prolong life in animal models have been situations where they've like starved the animal or given them very like just minimal food, just like the bare amount to survive. And because it slows down their metabolism so much, it's just the same concept that probably they accumulate like less oxidative damage over time, and they actually are able to like double the life expectancy of like certain insects or mice or whatever, like in a lab from doing that. But obviously like we don't want to have to starve ourselves, like that's the only thing that they've been able to
quality of life is also important.
Exactly.
It's like there was one joke where some old guy goes into the doctor, and the doctor says, "Oh yeah, you're great. You'll live another 20 or 30 years. All you got to do is you can't eat any of the foods that you like. You can't go and do any of the things that you like to do." And the
Yeah.
guy's just like, "Screw this," and then he just lives another 10 years where he's doing exactly what he wants, and he has a much happier existence. So there is a
Yeah.
trade-off. It's not just about living for as long as you can. Which
Yeah.
which leads me to another subtopic, which is cryonics, which I think is really interesting. Tim Urban of Wait But Why, he did a post about it a while ago, and people tend to think of cryonics as freezing rich dead people because they're not ready to accept the fact that they can no longer live.
Yeah.
But if you actually look at the science, it makes a ton of sense because our definition of what is meant by death, like where you draw the line of death, has drastically changed over time. Like, for instance, someone in the 1700s, if they got pneumonia, they're pretty much a goner. They'd be like, okay, this guy's done. And if someone on the street, their heart stops, they stop breathing, they'd be like, okay, this guy's dead. We pronounce him dead. We're going to bury him. But even nowadays, when someone's heart stops beating and they stop breathing, you don't just say, "Oh, well, he's dead." You do, mouth to mouth, you
CPR. Yeah.
EKG, like whatever. And you can imagine in the future that even what we pronounce as someone who's dead right now, which is 4 to 6 minutes of no oxygen going to the brain, that actually might not be a point of no return for maintaining your brain health. And they've actually been able to show that you can increase it to almost about an hour if you reintroduce warm blood and do some other sort of techniques. So the whole idea of cryonics is that they do not deal with dead people. They deal with people who are near death, and they don't actually freeze them. Instead, they basically, I forget the word for it, but they basically like turn it into glass. Vitrification, I think, is the process. And they have like liquid nitrogen. And the whole idea is that just like in the 1700s, how death was drawn at a much earlier line, the line of death now is much earlier than what we're going to have 100 years from now. So if we can just freeze someone for 100 years, 200 years, once the technology is there, and assuming the cryonics company is still around, then these people can essentially become fully healed, and maybe it'll just
Yeah. I
be
mean, I
like
think
waking up
like
from a long nap.
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to is, is there damage done to the neurons that is like reversible? Or, if you consider that your brain is then if you only go, a couple minutes without oxygen and then those cells die, and if you can't somehow reverse them and get them working again, then that's like how I would, define death. So, I mean, yeah, maybe by cooling things down, you get less damage once like the tissue's reperfused or something like that. But as of right now, I mean, we don't have a way that, once those cells are dead, they're dead. I mean, there's no way of bringing those back. So I don't know. I mean, the thing I'm a little skeptical about like cryonics or cryogenics, because at least my, basic understanding of it is that let's say you do like freeze somebody. I mean, you're also damaging the tissue. I mean, cells aren't really meant to be like lived that in temperatures that low. So,
Right.
Once you like
And
thaw
water
them out or
expands
whatever,
when it
like that
freezes.
tissue's dead.
Right. So well, that's why it's not actually freezing.
Yeah.
That was
But don't they pump you with chemicals too? So it's like they pump you with
You pump
chemicals.
an antifreeze.
So you don't. So the water doesn't freeze and expand, but surely the chemicals themselves do some
right.
damage.
Well, that's
That would
why.
be-
So there's actually companies that do this, like Acor, I think is the name of it, and for their premium price, you get your whole body frozen, which is something like $200,000 plus the amount for them to transport you once you actually die to their facility. And also they make you have a life insurance policy, so you basically pay for it throughout your life up until you die. But the alternate option, if you want to get a little bit of a better deal with your cryonics, is you just get your brain frozen, and that's only like $80,000, like which, a lot of people could afford that if they save for it throughout the rest of their life. So it's not like so out of the park as far as what like I've always wondered, would it even be something that would be worth pursuing in your own personal life? Because it's kind of really more of a philosophical question than a scientific question of if you would even want to both have the option of waking up in the year 2200 and and what that might be like, both as like a hit to your psyche, knowing everyone's dead, and also trying to adjust to this crazy new world. And it also could be like, you know, some people, especially if you're religious, you might, like, I know my mom would say, oh, well, you're not going to get to heaven if you do something like that. Mm-hmm. So it is more of a philosophical question. Would you guys ever consider, like, let's say you got a coupon and they said, you know what, because you're such a good data scientist, Justin, and because you're such a good ophthalmologist, Martin, we're going to have you be, we're going to comp your cryonics. Would you accept that?
I mean, I'm not going to bank on it working, but if they're giving it to me for free, then why not? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, could they like reverse the freezing damage? Could they like, you know, somehow reconnect your brain to a body? I mean, that's all like so far off and, you know, hypothetical as to whether that would ever even be possible. But I don't know. There's probably no harm in freezing your brain and hoping.
Yeah. Well, brain
yeah,
freeze.
I'd have to agree. But whenever you come back, is it even guaranteed that you're still you? Like, let's say a bunch of your brain cells die. Does some human that approximates what you used to be wake up, or is it actually...
That's a really good question.
Well, I think as long as you have all those connections, like all the neuronal connections in your brain that have the same pattern, and you didn't have any like cell death, then that is essentially you. I mean, you are definitely like in a lot of ways tied to your body, but I think your general, like if you able to like, you know, take your brain out of your body and put it into somebody else's, I still think that's, you know, that would be you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know,
so
as long as you're able to maintain those connections.
So if you're able to maintain, but if there was some cell death, then there might be some weird damage when you come out.
Then it would just be like you had a stroke or something, you know?
Yeah.
That's probably what it would be like.
Yeah, well, I was talking about this question with my friend Manny Rocha, he's a neuroscience researcher, and he thought the same sort of thing, that you pretty much are not only your brain, but you are your nervous system. So if you were to basically like pluck someone's brain out of their head and take also like the whole spine and all the nervous system and put that into like a cyborg body, that would be you in a cyborg body. It would very much be you. But
what if you had like in a cyborg body, you know, you had none of your, you know, sort of other physiologic drives and impulses, like you never got hungry, you know, you're in other ways you're really robotic, then it's like, is that you though? You know, is that still you?
Yeah, it's hard
Would you
to
still
say.
have all the
Well, I
would
mean,
you have all the haptic, like would you be able to feel everything, you know, on your hands and your arms? Like I feel like that's a huge part of being a biological creature, is having all of your senses.
Well, that's why Manny said it's not just the brain, it's your whole nervous system. But then my counter to that was, it seems like in the future we could also have artificial sensors. I mean, they're already trying to work on that for people who've lost limbs. So if you have your brain, but you have all of these artificial sensors, so it feels like you can feel your body, even if it's a cyborg body, through artificial sensors. It seems to me like you would still be you. But then if you go one step even further than that and you say, okay, well, is it actually your physical brain that makes you you? Or is it more the blueprint of all the connections of your brain and also the memories that you have? And if that's the case, couldn't you just basically take a 3D model of all of your connections and store all of the memories and basically transfer that into a full-on cyborg, like full-on robot? Would that still be you?
I think so, if you consider that it's not just like the physical mapping of all those neuronal connections, but how they all behave, you know, how they interact. And if you could some way, you know, be able to quantify that and give it to a computer, then yeah, I think that kind of would be you. But you have to know like which connections fire at which time, given which like stimuli. Like if you see this, then your brain does this. And I don't think that'll be possible until you have AI studying, like AI to just like map our brain.
But let me give another spin on it. Let's say that you do this 3D mapping of all the connections in someone's brain and you take all their memories, but rather than killing the original you, you keep the original you alive and you basically just download all of this into a robot. Would that mean there are two yous? Is the second one actually you? Because it seems to me like if you can copy something and not have to destroy the original, it's hard for me to believe that it would still be you. And I know it sounds like very sort of new agey, but intuitively it feels like what makes you you is more sort of your energy and your aura, more so than just like the raw connections. So it seems like in Latin, the word spirit comes from the Latin spiritus, which is they didn't think that you were your heart or your brain. They thought that you were the air in your body, like when you like breathe in. I know Justin and I have talked about this, but it's like that, like that's your life force. It's like, and you have this real energy. Like if you walk up behind someone lovingly versus if you walk up behind someone menacingly, they're gonna feel that. And so I almost wonder if what makes you you is more that sort of energy or aura that people have, and how could you transfer that energy over from a flesh and bones body to a robot body?
Yeah, we need to know what it is first. Like what, like on the most basic level, what is that aura actually? Is that like some sort of quantum effects? Yeah, like some sort of field that your body's creating. What is actually going on there?
I mean, it'll probably take some kind of combination of like machine learning and quantum computing to really even be able to understand how our brains work, because it's just so complicated, and I don't think any one human could ever really be able to understand how all those connections work and fire and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think because quantum computing really is studying things down to the quantum level. Like, wow, how do these molecules really interact? How does this behavior happen? Because it's not just being programmed in ones and zeros, it's giving you, different situations based on the behavior of molecules. Yeah. So like if you can, that would be the only way to be able to, potentially copy some kind of data set that really is you or whatever. But kind of to go back to your question about, let's say you copy yourself over into some other kind of like cyborg like thing, and then there's two of you sort of simultaneously, but both of you now from going forward from that point on are going to have like different life experiences, different things, and then that creates like different versions of you, almost like you in like a parallel universe,
like the Garden of Forking Paths. Mm-hmm. It's where so if you're familiar with the book The Garden of Forking Paths by Jean-Louis Bourget, I think that's how you pronounce it, but basically the idea is that if you believe in the multiverse theory, and whether or not you believe in free will, it doesn't really matter, but every decision that is made in every organism, that creates essentially another parallel universe, like not necessarily parallel, but it creates another version. So whenever I'm thinking, okay, am I going to go take a sip of this tea or am I going to take a sip of my LaCroix, that will create two different universes, and you basically fork out from that central point. And so it seems like, and I was talking to actually Kip about this, that if you make a big jump that changes either the organism itself or its relationship to the environment, or the environment, because it really is all one giant organism environment, then you're fundamentally changing the identity of that being. And it is still connected in a way because it forks off from the original path, but it might not be what we would consider close enough to be who we are right now. And I wonder if a lot of these forking paths lead to the same sort of digital immortality. And like some of the paths, they might continue to lead to something more similar to what we have right now. But it seems like in the long run, a lot of them might fork over to digital immortality, and it might not exactly be us, especially like if you consider, if you live for thousands of years, and if you are able to basically be without a body if you need to, like imagine how different you would be, because you're not like, you can't not describe any organism without also describing the environment. Like think of a frog. You try to describe the life of a frog without describing its environment, it's impossible. Like how does a frog reproduce? It meets other frogs and they do hanky panky. Like where does a frog live? How does it get food? It's all about the environment and the organism are this one thing. So if you fundamentally change that relationship and it becomes a robotic or even like a digital where you're this ephemeral, like basically Alexa, where you can, wherever the internet is, you are, wherever a camera is, you can see, wherever a sensor is, you can feel. That would be fundamentally different than what it is to be a flesh and bones.
And you'd be like a god.
Yeah, you would be a god.
Yeah.
And you could choose to be in the form of a body, just like Zeus can take the form of a goose and have sex with whomever he so pleases. It would be similar in that you can take whatever forms if it's convenient to you. But I guess the real question for me is, would that organism be happy? Would it have the capacity for happiness that we have? And would it be able to sustain that happiness for thousands of years? Or would it eventually just want to off itself?
Yeah. I don't know.
Probably depends. I mean, it depends on the experience of the organism. I'm sure some will be extremely happy. Some will be sick of it after a couple hundred years and just off themselves.
Well, and it's good to have that escape valve. It's kind of like being a vampire where, you can live forever, but if you ever have had enough, just get a silver steak or whatever, and you can
stab yourself.
Okay,
that would really change the discussion on suicide too.
Right. Well, I think the discussion on suicide's already changing
That's true.
Especially with euthanasia. I mean, did you hear that story that just came out where this old man went to a hospital and shot his wife who had terminal cancer and then shot himself? And people freaked out because they thought it was like an active shooter situation. But then it's like they realized this couple had been trying to find a way to end the pain. But because of the laws, there's no, like, euthanasia just isn't allowed in most places.
No, so I didn't hear about that.
It
is
into
an
his
organ,
own
I think.
hands.
Yeah.
Wow.
But anyways, I think now, we're about 45 minutes into it. I think we should talk about what we believe to be the worst case, the best case, and the most likely case for the future of health and mortality. So let's start with the worst case scenario, because that's the most fun. What do you think, let's say in the next, I don't know, 100 years, or we could go longer, we could go 1,000 years. Let's say the long term, the next 100 to 1,000 years, what do we believe the worst possible case is for the future of health and mortality?
So I think a lot of it is going to come down to like genetic engineering. And I think in the beginning, it'll be a really positive thing because you'll start curing people with diseases and disabilities. And, then almost it'll be like programming like designer babies. I think of the movie like Gattaca a lot of times as that is almost like a dystopian future that we could be headed towards, because it's like so reasonable that most people will be like, well, of course, if you give me the option to select for a gene like in my future child that will protect them from not getting cancer, like obviously I'm going to choose that. So there'll be a lot of really easy ones, and then it'll just become commonplace for a lot of people to do that for their kids. And then it'll become easy to manipulate like characteristics and things that are a little more like hair color or eye color, things like that. And those kind of things might only be available to people who have money to pay for it. And then you're almost creating like a greater separation between the rich and the poor. And
or
this,
they might only be available in countries like China for like starting off, and then we in the West realize, oh shit, if we don't do this as well, we're going to fall behind as a whole nation, as a whole people.
Yeah, like you could select for like IQ or like things like that. And then basically there might be prejudice against people who don't have that genetic makeup. And then you are in a situation like Gattaca where they won't even consider you for a job unless you hand over your DNA and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, you're flawed in this way. Or
rather
way.
Than asking someone on Tinder what they do for a living, you ask them, hey, can I have one of your hairs? Let me see what's under the hood.
But yeah, that's what I think.
So
what would that
lead to though? Like let's envision what that scenario would look like if everyone's sort of designer babies. Like what's the downside?
Well, I don't think it will happen to everyone. I think it'll only end up happening to wealthy people who are able to afford it. And then you're just like further widening the gap between rich and poor.
There's also the risk of people not truly understanding the genome yet and doing this prematurely, because even if you have genes for something, you still need to make sure that you're expressing the right genes.
Right. Well, it's like
Well, you have to be able to
my,
understand this like so well that you know exactly what you're doing with manipulating each gene. And that's why like the more experimental versions will come out in like extreme cases where people have like, very serious like hereditary disorders that they're trying to get out of their genome so that their child doesn't inherit something that could potentially be like life threatening within the first few years of life, something extreme like that. So that's probably how it'll first get introduced. But as it becomes better and better and better, it'll probably become easier, and you can select for these other, like, maybe you could argue less important genes,
Yeah. What about the interaction effects? Like, let's say you did select for an insanely high IQ, but it turns out that, one of the side effects of this is you also make a psychopath.
Right. Like you have
Or
no social
sociopath.
intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
I
that's
think
a
that we
question
don't know
if it's a
very
zero
much about
sum
it,
or
so
if it's
that's
not a
why
zero
it's like
sum.
very scary. Yeah.
Yeah, like my friend, the same guy Manny, the neuroscience researcher, he works with zebrafish, and they've genetically engineered zebrafish so they're all brain. So you basically got these zebrafish brains floating around in the bowl, and it allows them to study the brain in a very transparent way that you wouldn't typically be able to do. So I was asking him, I was like, well, what is it like to be a zebrafish brain? And he's like, well, it's probably not that great because it's not like all the connections are in place in the way that they should be. It's more just like a clump of like neurons, and it's probably a pretty miserable existence. So we don't want to.
I mean,
create,
is it conscious? I don't know.
So it's hard to know. But I actually think, as far as the worst case scenario, I think that's like pretty likely scenario. Like the worst case to me, I always go back to like, if you were basically in hell for eternity. I mean, that's the worst anything could possibly be. And if you think about immortality, there is always the risk of something like that happening. Like imagine if we achieve immortality, but we don't put in an escape valve, and then you've got these conscious beings that, like in that other episode of Black Mirror, where you're basically like trapped in this like room, and you cannot.
The guy keeps
escape.
reliving his execution over and over.
Oh,
yeah, that episode, yeah. So I mean, that's
as like
the worst
entertainment
case,
for other
but
people. Yeah.
I don't know how likely that would be. Also, but well, I guess the even worse thing would be if you can create almost like infinite conscious digital selves, and that's something Sam Harris actually talks about, is what if robots do become conscious, but we don't necessarily realize it, and they also have the capacity for suffering, and we unwittingly are creating all of these conscious immortal beings that are basically suffering for eternity, just while we're like tinkering with how to get the right one that fits our needs.
Yeah, if the objective function of a machine learning problem was actually causing suffering for computers, there would be a lot of suffering caused. I mean, that's the entire purpose, is introducing this objective function that, if that causes some sort of
because
pain,
that's what consciousness is. It's like if you don't have the ability to suffer, it's hard to argue that you're conscious in the sense that we consider to be conscious.
Right.
Like I think a tree can still suffer. I mean, they still give their resources to a dying tree. So I think all organisms do have some capacity for suffering, even if they don't have the same sort of pain that we do. So yeah, now let's move on to the best case scenario. So in the next 100 to 1,000 years, what is the best case scenario? So it seems like amongst us, we would want to live between 200 and 1,000 years with as good of a quality of life or better than we have now. So
as long as everyone else.
What would a world like that look like, right? Because if everyone is able to do that, how would that change demographics, population? If people stop dying, but new babies are continuing to be born.
Yeah, would you only have to be allowed to have like one child in order to replace yourself? So there's no like population issues then if everybody's living into their 300s?
Yeah, but even if you consider that, then, your kid, when they're age 20 or whatever, they have a kid, and, you're all living for thousands of years. So if you imagine like the already the birth rate is far outnumbering the death rate. So if you eliminate the death rate altogether, it seems like we would explode almost like a virus across the cosmos.
You have to use space colonization would be like the only
We would
way.
have to, yeah.
Are we still biological creatures in this situation? Because if we were cyborgs and didn't need food, we could reclaim a lot of land that's, making corn and make cities. So we could, if we didn't need to eat, we could probably increase the carrying capacity of Earth a little bit more.
But then it's like if you're living for like 300 years and you're really able to reverse aging or slow down the aging process, I mean, then you can just be like, all right, well, you have a child when you're like 100 years old. And that's like, just like your whole time scale is different. It's about a third of your life there that,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I think we will end up in the next 100 years curing most of the major illnesses. Like, I think cancer, there'll be a developed, you'll test for each individual cancer and you'll have a specific therapy targeted for whatever the, genetic disorder or the mutation is in that cancer. And if there's ways that we can slow down or even reverse the aging process through, the new technologies of stem cells, gene therapy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's kind of the way I think it's going. And then, most of your medical care will be like maintenance, like we were talking before, just like going in for these regular checkups. Hopefully they'll be able to pick up on like little changes, before it actually causes any pathology, and then they'll have ways to reverse it and somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what do you guys think the life expectancy would be when we make those strides? Like, even just like, let's say we cure cancer. What do you, so the life expectancy up until now, currently in the first world, it's about 80 years old. But if you look up until now, it doesn't rise gradually. It rises in jumps. Like when we come out with antibiotics, when we realize germs are a thing, when we make these certain discoveries, there's a big jump. So it seems like curing cancer and other of the most common diseases that would be somewhat of a jump. What do you think that jump would be in the first world for people that are able to benefit from it if it's 80 years right now?
Yeah, I've heard.
I think it comes to you got to prevent this damage from happening in the first place, or like find a way to reverse it if it's happened. Like your arteries are hardening as you're aging, and as long as that's happening, your blood pressure is going up, and it's going to increase your risk of having a stroke down the line. And like you have to prevent all those factors that like create the situation for disease, from happening in the first place, and that's the only way. We've done a good job with a lot of the medications for heart disease, especially with like bypass surgery, stents. I mean, I think people are living longer. We're doing a better job because of that. Cancer treatment's getting better. It's definitely getting there. But the final frontier is the brain. I mean, we still do not know so much about the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. And, even if your heart's pumping away and even if your body's like relatively, mobile with some of your new joints and things like that. I mean, if your brain is atrophying and dying, I mean, what kind of quality of life is that? So that is really what I think is if you're going to live for 200 years and you want the same quality of life, we have to be able to figure out like what makes, neurons degenerate specifically in like these diseases like Alzheimer's, but also there's just like normal aging atrophy. Like if you get a scan of somebody's brain in their 70s or 80s, a lot of times they're just like normal aging process, like a little bit of, atrophic brain. It's just like a little bit smaller. I mean, you're not as sharp as you were when you were in your 20s. It's just, that's part of the aging process. And we got to find a way to prevent that or reverse that.
Well, I've heard that there's neuro stem cells that you could potentially use to create any sort of neuron that you would need. And then, like you said, the difficulty is how do we actually put it in the right place and make it interact in the right way so it's all connected. It seems like with nanotechnology, machine learning, with all of the advances that are being made, it seems to me like that will certainly happen in the next 100 to 1,000 years. Probably not before. I mean, maybe it'll happen during our lifetime. You never know with AI because it could just be a rapid hockey stick progress. But
I think it all rests on quantum computing, as we were discussing further. I mean, if you have that kind of power to compute that much data, then maybe they hit that point at somewhere in the next 10 to 20 years, then maybe the developments will just be like, a million times faster than it would have been otherwise. And we could see it happen in our lifetime.
Because quantum computing takes into account how the universe actually works with probabilities, and I feel like it also takes into account the multiverse, and maybe we'll end up like having to sort of draw on energy from other Other parallel universes.
Other parallel
Like
universe.
we're like sucking out the life from like all of these poor people who took a sip of tea instead of a sip of LaCroix. But thankfully, it allows us to live on for a long time, just like vampires sucking blood from human hosts. No, I'm mostly kidding.
But not really.
Not really, though. So let's talk about if this is a real possibility that the technology one day, potentially soon, will be there so that we could either slow down, stop, or reverse the aging process. What should we do in our own lives to live as long and healthy of a life as we can until those advancements are made? What tips do you guys have?
So
And I guess
increasing our
also,
health
what have you done in your own lives that you found to be beneficial as far as your diet, your exercise, like any other tips just for listeners as far as how they can stay as healthy as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think it's like that complicated right now, and I wish there was like a more, kind of way to biohack your body and have exactly like X number of nutrients or vitamins. And I think all that stuff is not really proven right now. I mean, I think just the general principles are like, like don't smoke cigarettes, like eat relatively healthy, mostly like plant-based diet, like enough protein kind of thing, and to get enough exercise, like both something that's going to build your muscles and your and like strengthen your cardiovascular system. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's nothing that people haven't heard before,
Yeah. I like to look to the old guys that are still really fit. Like, for example, Laird Hamilton, who's a big wave surfer, and Mark Sisson, who's an ultra marathoner or was. But they are in their 60s and they look like they're probably 30. I think it's probably good to look at the older people who've actually been there, done that, and have a healthy life when they're old, because there's a lot of snake oil out there too.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the Instagram models that like post health advice, low fat diet, like no fat and all that good stuff. And I don't know, it can be really damaging.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it comes down to stress levels. And if you, like, Laird Hamilton, for instance, surfing is a very meditative activity. I was just surfing yesterday, and you just feel this communion with the cosmos when you're out there amongst the waves and the fluctuations of the ocean. And same thing with yogis. I read this book by this guy who basically did brain scans of some of the greatest Tibetan monks and compared them to other people in the urban societies who were the same age. And these yogis had brains of basically like 40-year-olds at age 70. And I think a lot of that's because they've been able to manage their stress levels and they're not constantly suffering in the same way, which reminds me of this other book that my friend Romel recommended, which is it's a fiction book. It's called Lost Horizons, and it's basically about this mythical land called Shangri-La in the mountains of China, and this plane crashes and these people go there, and people there live hundreds of years. And the people who are outsiders, who are from the fast-paced world of London and World War I or whatever, they go there and they realize everyone there is living such peaceful lives. No one looks at their clocks. No one really rushes with anything. Everything is done very deliberately. They sit around, they drink green tea, they read books, they talk amongst themselves, they live everything in moderation, and they have this feeling of just peacefulness and serenity with all of their surroundings and with all of the people there. And I think that's a good lesson for how everyone can live a longer life, is if just try to manage your stress. Like for me, like smoking weed helps me, and it's better than a lot of the prescriptions that I would otherwise take to manage my anxiety. Being with nature, like walking in the grass, being out in the ocean. I think that, getting your enough sunlight, but not too much sunlight. I think those are all like things that have been successful for humans for thousands of years, and we should stick to those practices and really try to like minimize our stress to live a longer life.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think there are factors like, genetic factors that are out of your control maybe, and environmental factors that we don't really know. Like maybe, there's some kind of toxin in our water or something that we just haven't studied, and like all these other things. But then there are like another third of it is probably things that are under your control, like all the
Right.
things that you mentioned, like reducing stress, taking the best kind of care of yourself, like eating right, exercising, like all those things are so important, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big things recently has been sleep too. There's this researcher named Matthew Walker out of Berkeley, and he just wrote a book called Why We Sleep, but it basically outlines the entire it gives us a lot of research into why that's probably the best anti-aging strategy you can have, besides picking your parents and grandparents so you get good genetics, which is the best anti-aging strategy.
That's another thing that this is a little bit unrelated, but I read this other sleep study that basically studied people in Africa who live in very much the same way that we lived thousands of years ago, and they studied the sleep patterns of the tribal members. And what they found is that older people sleep much shorter amounts of time just naturally, which we kind of already knew. Especially grandmas tend to sleep the lowest amount. And the basic conclusion of this article is that this was part of our system for basically maintaining safety amongst the tribe, because they would almost be like the canaries in the coal mine, that because they didn't sleep for very long, if anything happened, like someone came to attack or a wild animal came in or whatever, they would be there. So there is this natural cycle for things where we tend to live for 1.5 million or a billion heartbeats, and older people tend to sleep less. So I think being in touch with those natural rhythms, while we also develop ways to surpass those biological limitations scientifically, is probably the best parallel solution we can do for both of those.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're coming to the end of this. It's been a really great discussion. Is there anything else that you guys have wanted to say that you feel like we haven't touched on yet?
I don't know. I feel like we've touched on a lot.
Well, I just want to ask Martin when we're going to have contacts so we can see other wavelengths, so we can see infrared and ultraviolet light and increase the bounds of our perception like that.
Well, I mean, I think that limitation rests on like our natural biological like photoreceptors that we have in the back of our eye. You know, it's not going to be something that you're going to be able to change by just putting something in the front of your eye. And we've adapted to be able to see certain wavelengths of light because, I don't know, there are different theories, but like a lot of the visible spectrum, like penetrates only so deep into water, and life probably began in, you know, some like lake or ocean or something like that. So that's why we've developed the ability to see those. So I don't think like a contact would change that. But
that brings up an interesting point, which is that we can only see a very narrow spectrum of life, of what's out, of what's out there. And like just like how we can only hear a certain narrow spectrum of all the sound wavelengths that there are. So it seems to me, and also if you believe in string theory, there's something like 11 dimensions, and we only can perceive 3 of them. So it seems to me like there are higher dimensions out there, and it would be, I think, arrogant to think that there are not higher dimensional beings than ourselves. So it seems like as we talk about the far-reaching future of health and immortality, maybe what ends up happening is we basically become higher dimensional beings, because if we become immortal, we're essentially freeing ourselves from time,
from our biological limitations.
And maybe we will have vast amounts of joy and happiness, and we'll just have this higher level of understanding, and we'll be amongst all the other higher dimensional beings. It'll just be this like grand like tree of life, kumbaya, beautiful existence, sunsets and sunrises all the time.
Sounds awesome. Give me some of that.
Nice, yeah.
I'm in.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, we're all in. Well, thank you everyone for listening. This has been the future of health and mortality. I want to especially thank Dr. Martin Mullen for joining us, our very first guest. Also, always thanking Justin and our listeners. You guys can know how to reach out to us. Please rate and review us wherever you go. Hence the Future on all our social media. You can give us a suggestion on hencethefuture.com. And we will tell you what the next episode will be sometime in the upcoming week. We have not decided yet, but tune in next time. Thanks.
talk about what has happened, what is currently happening, and what will inevitably happen.
The past, the present,